So hello everyone and welcome to our end of year masterclass, a wrap on some of our favourite masterclasses for 2023. My name is Caitlin Ziegler. I'm a director at GRIST and I'm joined as always by my colleague, Kate Golby, GRIST Senior Behavioural Analyst. Now for those of you who don't know us, here's a little bit about GRIST. We're a change management consultancy that specialises in the people side of change. We've been doing it for 30 years. Our programs drive behavioural change that is reflected in real-world performance results while developing skill, boosting engagement, lifting motivation and helping your people to achieve their goals. Now, we have a whole panel of special guests joining us today, and I am going to introduce them to you in a minute. But first, just a little bit of housekeeping. So to interact with us, please use the chat function in your control panel. You can ask us questions or make comments at any point through the session. We're going to have an open discussion at the end of the webinar, so please type in your questions as you go, as you think of them, and we will absolutely visit those questions as we get to the end of the discussion. Now today, as I mentioned, is a wrap up of all our best bits. We've got highlights from all of our webinars across 2023. And that brings me to introducing our special panel of guests. Now we have with us Mike Dunn, director, consultant, and he will be talking a bit about coaching mindset. We also have Mimi Wong, who's a senior partner and consultant, whose work with Vic Roads this year was a highlight, and she's going to be talking a little bit about that. Then we have Peter Grist, our Managing Director, who has something to say on why learning and development is the most valuable department in your organisation. Following Peter, we also have Stacey Makchakova. She's our Insights and Innovation Manager, and she's going to talk about what skills we will be needing for the future. And then last but certainly not least, David McQueen, Head of Sales, and he is going to share his thoughts on the Seinfeld strategy. Now, Kate is going to get our conversation started today. So over to you, Kate.
Thank you, Caitlin. Now, Dave, I'm going to start with you. You joined us for our first webinar of 2023, speaking about the Seinfeld strategy. Now, I don't know how many of you out there are Seinfeld fans, but I was a mad fan in high school. I watched every episode multiple times. So I was very intrigued when I came across this strategy. And so I did a bit of reading into it, and for the audience who don't know anything about it, the story essentially is that there was a budding comedian who bumped into Jerry Seinfeld at a comedy club and just, asked him for some tips on how he could be a better comedian and improve his skills. And Jerry Seinfeld's response was, the way to be a better comic is to write better jokes, okay? But the way to write better jokes is to just write every day. He suggested, getting a big wall calendar with a texter and just marking for each day that he wrote. So the idea was that just keep marking and try to create a chain. So every day he would write and mark on that day a big red X. And the idea was just don't break the chain. And the story goes that, by focusing and maintaining that chain of writing every day, this young comedian was able to consistently produce some quality work and, pretty crucially, avoid procrastination, which I can imagine is a big problem in that kind of industry. So, Dave, now we know a little bit more about that Seinfeld strategy. Can you maybe give us some idea of how we could take away those principles and apply them to being a better coach?
Yeah, oh, good. I'm glad we're talking about coaching and not being a joke teller, because that ain't me. But yeah, it's a really interesting concept, right? The first thing I'd probably say is that, if the only thing that a leader needed to do was to be a better coach, then that's all we'd focus on, right? But it's not. Clearly as leaders, just one of the things that around the myriad of things that we need to do in order to be an effective leader. So, I'll just talk about a couple of different things that we could do in order to make the Seinfeld strategy work within our everyday roles. So first off, it's really about the operating rhythm that we put in place to coach. Yeah, it's about putting in a system that helps us to deliberately practice the craft. Yeah, for me, Seinfeld's message is about having the discipline of doing it regularly. So in many organizations, the rhythm that we see is often of 1 hour per person per month, right? And when we really look into that, what we often see is that conversation fills with so much other stuff. It fills with performance metrics, it fills with operational issues, and it doesn't actually end up being much about coaching at all. What we tend to recommend is that this shift towards more frequent or shorter coaching sessions that are focused on really helping the team member to improve their skill. And that's really where the magic happens, right? Leaders with these types of cadences get a real grasp on their team's abilities really quickly. And, their people start to see and feel the leader's desire to help them want to get better, right? And it just about ends up showing up in every performance metric that you can think of. So, it may not be about coaching every day, but it's definitely about coaching much more than once a month. The second thing that I'd probably add here is just that, when you're coaching more often, when you have that cadence in place, you actually have a chance to tweak your style. It's a little bit like refining your craft. Yeah. So whether it's keeping conversations on track, dealing with tricky mindsets, or just setting better quality goals, frequent practice helps you to improve just bit by bit. So, just like Seinfeld did with his jokes, or how a professional athlete starts to perfect their technique, in our experience, when you have a very specific focus that to improve your coaching skills and you're coaching regularly, it's amazing how quickly that you can improve. And as you get better, so does your team's engagement, and then so does your team's whole performance.
Yeah, so it's about that regular practice. It might not be every day. We know that that's not feasible in a lot of organizations, but it might be twice a week, and just creating that rhythm and consistently doing it and practicing that regular practice that they're hoping. Yeah. And so if we think about practice, and we want to do it regularly, right? But as far as what kind of practice, what do we do? Are all practices created equal?
Well, I don't think that's quite true, but it's a really interesting concept, isn't it? I think a great way to think about this is about learning how to play the guitar, right? So just strumming the guitar aimlessly, it's not going to make you a rock star. And it's kind of the same with coaching. My kids are heading into next year's final sort of exams at school, and they've got their study plans in place, but it's what they do in those study sessions that really count, right? So simply reading their textbook over and over, well, that's not going to do it. What they really need to do is start to tackle past exam papers and work on really tough practice questions, because that's the real deal, right? This concept of, it's deliberate practice is really, really important. And when the psychologists Erickson and Moxley sort of like developed this concept back in the 1990s, in addition to actually having this regularity of practice, what they really needed to do was they needed to make sure the practice was targeted and challenging enough to start to push yourself out of your current skill level. So, if you're a new coach, for example, you might start with the basics, things like how do you structure a coaching session, or how do you ask rather than tell a bit more often. And then once you've got that down, you move to the next level, like tackling resistance, or how do you gain buy-in more effectively. But really it's about stepping out of your comfort zone and one skill at a time. And in our experience, that's how you start to, truly level up your coaching game, Kate.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for that, Dave. That's given us a real taster into that whole strategy and how it can be applied into so many different areas.
Pleasure.
We're going to jump over to Mimi now. Now, Mimi is a GRIST consultant who has worked really closely with Vic Rhodes this year to lift their capability in tactical leadership and coaching. Now, Mimi, earlier this year, we interviewed Jing, a back of house leader with Vic Rhodes. And we discussed quite in depth about how we're quite guilty of focusing on customer-facing teams in a lot of our examples. And when it comes to coaching, this is the reason for this is probably that so many organizations really do put so much focus on their frontline customer conversations. So what do you think it was about the program that you worked with Vic Rhodes with that really resonated with their back of house leaders?
Kate, we've definitely all been a little bit guilty on focusing just on that customer frontline conversation, because a lot of the time businesses think that's where the magic happens, but it actually also happens back of house. When we started the Vic Rose program, we deliberately mixed up frontline and back of house leaders into workshops. So we had front of house leaders from the contact centre, from service centre. We had back of house leaders from support services and corporate services. And I will say there were quite a few of those back of house leaders that rocked up to that first workshop and went, why am I even here? Very quickly in that first workshop, they had that aha moment where they went, wow, what I do has got an impact for the customer, whether it was directly or indirectly. We had people from marketing, compliance, IT, workforce planning, properties, and they all started to realise how their role impacted the customer. For example, think about workforce planning. They have to make sure they've got the right skilled people at the right place at the right time for the customer. With properties, they have to not only make sure they've got a clean and safe workplace for team members, but also for the customer as well. So they really quickly realised that those internal or external conversations still had an impact on the customer. And that was really where the buy-in came in. Now, naturally, across all those different roles and functions, everyone had different things that they needed to achieve, different performance objectives, strategies, etc. But inevitably, there was always some sort of behaviour, whether it was from themselves, from their team members, from stakeholders, that needed to drive those performance objectives. And that's where ACDC, that coaching framework, really came to life. And it's so agile that people found it worked in all those different functions and areas. In fact, one of the really great things that we saw as we walked through the buildings over the 3 to 6 months that I went in and out of that building is we started to see ACDC framework huddles all around the place. All the leaders started to use it in their leader-to-leader activities. I even had stories from leaders come back saying they were using it to coach sports with their spouses. I won't recommend that. We take no responsibility for marriage counselling, but even mentoring kids groups. So people found that ACDC framework was really, really agile and flexible to have different conversations.
So maybe I'd love to jump in there and just talk a little bit more about ACDC and that coaching framework. Can you tell me, how did Vic Rhodes use that ACDC framework to coach then to their values?
Yeah, absolutely, Caitlin. So with Vic Rhodes, one of their value statements is care, share, dare. Now, they did actually really, really well with care and share, but with dare, they probably weren't so great. And that was one thing that the leaders wanted to prioritise and really work on. And we do know a lot of our clients, they want to empower their people. I mean, it's a bit of a buzzword, empowering people. ACDC framework provides a really good platform and safety for team members to come up with their own ways to solve problems with the guidance of their leaders. And we also further supported it with some micro-behavioural frameworks, which meant that it gave additional guardrails for front of house and back of house on certain micro-behaviours. So even if it didn't solve the problem, it still absolutely improved the skill with other benefits involved. So not only did it encourage innovation, but then it also taught them really valuable analytic skills as well. The other reason ACDC worked really well to help people feel safe to dare is because leaders started to realise very quickly they didn't need to be the expert. They didn't have to know all the answers. ACDC was actually encouraging and facilitating team members to come up with their own ways to solve the problem. And that was a real relief for a lot of the leaders, especially long tenured leaders who actually had a big sigh of relief because they absolutely thought the pressure was on them.
Thanks, Mimi. That was a really comprehensive and interesting way to look at how you tie together those sort of front of house and back of house leaders in that coaching framework as well. I'd like to stay on coaching there. And Mike, I'd like to hear a little bit about mindset and how it relates to coaching now, and just how important is mindset when it comes to coaching on performance?
All right. Well, you would probably say that mindset is literally the very beginning or the starting point of all performance, at least any performance that actually people are involved in. If there's an outcome that is people related, their actual mindset and all the rest of it is quite crucial to sort of getting any result. And those of you that know our basic sort of model, it is mindset shapes behavior, which shapes results. So how a person thinks will determine what it is that they do or don't do, and what they do or don't do will determine the results that they actually get. And I know there's going to be a number of coaches sort of watching this webinar, but it's often referred to as skill and will. And people can have a whole lot of skill, but if the will is not physically there, they often don't use the actual skills required to get the result that they want to get. There's been a lot of research done on I guess, sort of the importance of skill versus will, and it's a little bit varied, but depending on sort of what book you read, basically the general consensus is that as much as 80% of your likelihood to be successful or get a result really does come down to your mindset and how you think, and that maybe only 20% skill related, assuming you have the skill to do the job that you're employed to do. So if you're thinking about an individual and how important their mindset actually is to performance, and if you're a leader, it really is about, for want of a better word, being able to help your people get into the best sort of state or mindset that they can, so that they can achieve the various sort of outcomes that you're after for them to achieve. And if you look at a whole team, for example, because leaders obviously lead a whole bunch of people, the art of leadership, I mean, we can talk about sort of coaching skills. That's often where it begins. That's the easy stuff. But the real art of leadership is the ability to really sort of cultivate a mindset within your business or within your teams that helps you get where you want to go. And I'm sure there's a lot of leaders that have got a lot of experience in trying to do that. And what you generally find with mindset is that mindset can be very fickle. Mindset can be very transient. There are times where you can have a team really humming and operating almost at their peak. And there are other times where the mindset or the thinking of the team can really go in a different direction. And it can be very, very difficult to manage and very, very difficult to align people behind, I guess, strategic goals and outcomes if the general mindset or thinking within the team is not supporting what you're trying to do.
And so, given that it is so important, what capacity do coaches have on actually impacting it? What can they do to lift that group mindset or the mindset of an individual?
Probably the number one most important thing for a leader or a coach to remember is that they are actually, if not the number one, but they're at least in the top two primary experience givers that their people have. And what I mean by that is we have a sort of a more extended model at GRIST where experiences that people have shape their mindset, which shapes the behavior, which shapes the result. So your team's primary experience giver is the leader, if that makes sense. And leaders are always being watched. Everything a leader does is seen, it's noticed, and there's a message received from what leaders do. And those messages start to form a set of beliefs within a person's mindset, which dictates their behavior. And what you often don't see leaders or coaches do enough of is really get deliberate around what is the mindset that they want to create within their team, what are the values and beliefs they want their sort of people to embrace, and what experiences do I, as the leader or the coach, need to give those people consistently to start shaping the sort of thinking that supports where we want to go. I think what happens a lot with mindset coaching or leadership is accidental mindset creation through subsets of experiences that leaders will offer, but not necessarily with the intent of trying to create a certain way of thinking. And I know sort of with a number of the different groups I've worked with, it really is about thinking, right, what's the mindset you want to cultivate in your team, and what experiences do you need to start delivering as a leader to shape that thinking, to shape probably what the most important thing is towards generating performance, which is the group think.
Thanks, Mike. I think we could keep talking about that subject for a very long time, but we are going to shift gear and look a little bit more at learning development more generally. Peter, this one's over to you. I've heard you say that learning development has never been so critical to an organisation's success. Can you talk us through a little bit of your thinking there?
Someone was saying who's going to be the first to start talking while they're on mute. Well, I just about did. So
you got the bingo.
Yeah, I've got the bingo. Thank you. I'll be a little bit controversial, but I think many organisations are sleepwalking towards a talent and capability cliff. And let me explain a little bit more about why I would say that. Like, it's no news to anyone that we're living in times of unprecedented change. And if you look at all the trend analysis, that shows no sign of slowing down. In fact, it's probably going to move quicker. Think COVID, which accelerated many underlying trends that were already underway. Working from home is just one example that, we just couldn't make it work. And then all of a sudden, particularly in Australia, when we had a lockdown, all of a sudden we made it work. But we're also seeing, technology has been driving change for decades now, but with the introduction of AI, you can just see how it's going to go another whole level. So we can see that the rate of change is happening quickly. So that leads to a very logical conclusion that the skills that your people have today are not the skills that they're going to need tomorrow. In fact, the World Economic Forum is telling us that 60% of the entire workforce will need to be retrained by 2027. So just you stop and think about that. That's 6 out of every 10 people is going to need to be retrained in the next, if we go to next year, it'll only be 3 years away. So, that's why we're really talking about the L&D function being absolutely so critical. If we add the demographic changes in countries like Australia and New Zealand, where we're seeing ageing populations, we're going to have a smaller cohort of young people entering organisations. So the ability to retrain and then retain the people in your organisations is going to become absolutely mission critical in the future. And then that challenge is not big enough in itself, but for organisations where a large percentage of their workforce is now working from home, they actually haven't got many of the tools that we used to use to train and develop people, like get them together in a workshop, observation, osmosis. So many of those techniques that we used to use to build capability are actually taken away from us. So, yeah, there's some really big challenges coming down the line for the L&D, and that's why I think they're so critical.
Okay, so given that real critical point that L&D is going to be required so heavily on in the next few years, do you think, I'll give you a double barrel question here. Do you think the L&D industry is equipped to meet this challenge? And also, we know that L&D, most organisations have them, but they're really rated up at that sort of really high influential level in an organisation. So how do we get them and raise them up there so they become a trusted advisor of organisations?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, whenever industries and organisations go through a transformational change, I just start by saying no one's got the capability they need to be successful in the future. And I don't think L&D is any different. The traditional approaches to L&D were built for another time, and they're just not going to cut it as we move forward into the future. So, there's a huge need for L&D to shift both their thinking and their mindset that Mike was just talking about. What's their purpose? Why are they actually here? And they're going to have to shift their capability to align with that as well. So, to that sort of next part of your question about how they make that shift and change their role. Everyone's heard of a chief financial officer, a chief technical officer, but very few people have heard of a chief learning officer. And so what I mean by that is, we've still got the learning department sitting in under the sort of chief people officer and sort of almost subservient to that department. My view is that the L&D inside organisations needs to shift up a level at every level. And I think it's actually mission critical to the point where we probably should have CLOs, like chief learning officers that have a seat at the executive table in organisations, so that they can get the focus on the size of the challenge that is coming down the line for any organisations that needs lots of people. And so how I'd look at that, if you want to try and put that into, a little example, learning and development's been very focused on building content and programs. Content and programs are going to become free and ubiquitous pretty much. AI can generate programs. Everyone's putting free. There's been an explosion of content online, LinkedIn Learning, all of those things. That's not the issue. It's about learning culture. And L&D needs to be the custodian of the learning culture and think less about content and programs. And what that means is that the L&D department has got to influence the organisation to realise that it's not just the L&D's problem, and that the whole operational side of the business has got to play their role, because the only way we're going to keep up is if we start learning every single day in the flow of work. Just learning to do new and different things just becomes what we do every single day. And so back to Mike's point, that's a change in mindset for both the L&D department and the operations. Back to your point, Dave, it's about the Seinfeld principle of you learn a little every single day, and the organisation has got to be set up to make that happen. Yeah. Now, finally and quickly, for the L&D team to play that role, they're going to have very different conversations with their key stakeholders, and that's going to require a whole new skill set of them, where they move up to that trusted advisor level, where they're helping the organisation make some strategic calls and building capabilities. So that's it.
Thanks, Peter. That's a lot to think about in terms of learning development and the future of that. I would like to home in on just a couple of points that you made there around automation and AI, because I think that's something that we've all talked about a lot this year and certainly worried about a lot this year. Stacey, you did some research into how technology is going to change work in the future, but also about what work itself will look like. Can you tell me a little bit about what skills you saw in that research that would be needed, given that we're facing into these sorts of challenges from automation and AI?
Yeah, absolutely. But the first thing I want to say that it's not all doom and gloom. ChatGPT is not going to take over our jobs just yet. And when I was looking into the research, I can see sigh of relief from
for everybody.
Yeah. The research that I was looking at, it was coming from different sources, I guess, and that includes international organizations like World Economic Forum, industry reports, and because I'm a nerd, I was also looking into academic papers as well, just to get a comprehensive view of what kind of skills people will need in the future. And depending on which research source you look, you will see around 3 to 4 categories of skills that people will need. And the first one is, of course, data and digital skills. And usually when you mention those skills, people start automatically thinking about, oh, that must be something like data science, machine learning, cybersecurity, and all other popular topics nowadays. But it also actually includes basic digital skills. You will be surprised how many people have relatively low digital literacy, and it's really important to lift everyone up so that everyone can confidently be using the technology. And it's interesting, when I was looking into the research, I saw that in some industries such as healthcare, retail, and transport, it's almost 70%. People will be spending 70% more time using digital skills by 2030 than they ever did before. So digital is one group of skills. The next one is cognitive skills. And that includes our ability to solve complex problems, think analytically, think critically, and also think creatively. One of the latest reports by World Economic Forum, and I think it's Future of Jobs report, they mentioned analytical and creative thinking skills as the top 2 skills that not only companies are mentioning as something that they need right now, but something that will be growing in importance in the future. The third group is quite an interesting one because even though some call it skills, it's actually a mix of skills, abilities, and even character traits. And that includes things like resilience, self-awareness, motivation, and lifelong learning. Again, something that Peter was talking about, learning culture, that speaks to that, our ability to continuously improve. And of course, finally, something that is very dear to our hearts, and that is the skills of social influence, which include communication and leadership skills.
That certainly is music to our ears, Stacey. And yes, communication skills, social influence, very close to our heart. Absolutely. Let's dig a bit deeper into that then. Can you tell us a little bit about why is it that those skills are going to become so important in the future?
There are a few reasons for that. So one is these are the kind of skills that are not that easy to automate. So I know that ChatGPT can help you to write something much better than probably you would have without it, but it still is not going to automate the actual need for us to communicate and collaborate. The second reason is, and this is something that's fundamental to all of us, the psychological research has shown that people have a need for relatedness. We need to connect with each other, and communication is one way to do that. So we will need still to address that need somehow in the future. And the third reason is that the time that we are going to spend communicating and collaborating is going to increase. So I looked into the research that Australian National Skills Commission did, and they ranked all different skill clusters in order of how much more time people will be spending in the future using those skills. And communication and collaboration came up the top. And it's logical because if you think that if you're going to automate some of the repetitive tasks, you will be spending the rest of the time communicating, collaborating, creating ideas, and working together within the team.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Stacey. Now, I want to remind everyone, please, if you have any questions and want to be part of the discussion today, please do use that chat function and send some questions through. We've gone through all of our prepared questions now, and we're opening up to a bit of an open discussion, I suppose, from you, our audience members, and for our guests here today as well. We've got you guys captive for a few more minutes, so I will open it up for you all to sort of ask each other some questions. But before I do, we did get one question come in from Chad. So I might pose this one. I'll begin with you, Stacey, and then if anyone else would like to weigh in, please do so. Now, the question Chad sent through was, how can we directly link L&D initiatives to operational performance at a mature level that goes above attendance and happy sheets? Stacey, would you be able to give us your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the part of the role that I'm doing is looking into evaluation of all the programs that we are running. And when we think about the operational performance and how we can link the learning development initiatives, the first thing we need to start thinking is, okay, what are the operational objectives we want to achieve? And then be very clear and specific on that. And then thinking, okay, what are the kind of behaviors that are going to predict those outcomes? So is this something that people need to be doing more of? Is this something that people need to be doing less of? And once you are clear on those behaviors, then you design the learning and development initiative around that. And for when you track whether the initiatives are effective, what you look for is, was there a shift? Have people started doing things that they were supposed to be doing, or have they stopped doing the things? And depending on how your systems are set up and what kind of behaviors you're looking for, it may be as simple as, for instance, if one organization tracks accident logs and that predicts some of the security and objectives, they can see that people were logging accidents at this level before the program, and then they started logging that more frequently at the end of the program. So they can see some of the shift in that metric. Other behaviors may be a little bit more challenging to track, and especially when it comes to coaching or maybe some other behavioral change. And this is where some other form of a tracking system would help. Again, you identify what kind of behavior you want to see, and you either get people to essentially log whether they are doing this during the program and, of course, after the program. So it's very important to be specific on the behaviors that you want to change, because that's what will get you those results.
Fantastic. And Peter, have you got anything you'd like to add to that one? Mute.
Once again, Stacey, spot on. I think the thing I'd add is that, you know, as Stacey said, you've got to be really clear about the behaviour that you want to see in your people, and then you need to set up systems and processes to know whether that behaviour is being demonstrated or not. You know, and the only way to really know that is you actually have to observe it. And then we come back to, once again, leaders being in the field, actually coaching and developing their people. But what we find is organisations are notoriously bad at both, firstly, identifying the outputs they want from the program. You'd think that was pretty easy. It's not always that easy. But secondly, defining the behavioural change they want to see. And when you ask them, they will still keep talking about outputs, not behaviours. So, you know, how do you think we're going to get in? What would happen? Oh, we just need to get all of our people to be better at building rapport. Okay, well, hang on, that's not a behaviour, right? That's still an output. So it takes a lot of work to really get organisations to think very clearly, right down to an observable and accessible behaviour. So that's the only thing I'd add, Stacey, is that extra challenge of trying to get behavioural.
Yeah, it's a good point. Often when you ask the question, so how will you know it's working? So often the answer to that question is metrics and KPIs and things that are lagging indicators rather than leading indicators. So there's a big gap there between, you know, how do we get those early signs that we're going down the right path, that, you know, to your point, Stacey, that behaviours that are predictive of outcome. Yeah. And, you know, this is where I think there's, I mean, not that it's a plug, but our sister company, YakTrack, yeah, like if you're interested in actually working at or seeing a system that can measure behaviour unlike any system that we have ever come across before, go and check out YakTrack, because it's when we use it in our programs as a way of tracking predictive behaviours and evidence of implementation. You know, it's a tool that gives us fantastic insights into, especially those leading indicators that are predictive of outcomes.
All right. And do any of our panelists, our guests today, have any questions for our other guests? Anything that you wanted to probe them on, or a point that you might have heard that you want to know a little bit more about? Everyone was sort of very keen on the mindset. I don't know, is there anything else we'd like to?
I got a question for Kate. Sorry, I got a question for Stacey, Kate. But Stacey, you spoke about these different types of evidence required. You know, but what sort of evidence would you be suggesting that would give organisations some comfort that people were actually making behavioural improvements and shifting their behaviours? I mean, what sort of things would you look at when evaluating the success of a programs for that?
It's an interesting question, and that depends on the, I guess, complexity of the behavior. So some of the things can be done through a self-report, when people report in the beginning how frequently they are doing certain things, and then at the end of the program they report again. But that needs to be validated. So you would ideally want, again, a leader provide their own perspective on that. Have they seen the shift in the behaviors, or they haven't? An alternative way, which is quite similar sometimes, and it works for more complex behaviors where, for instance, some of the programs, it's not the problem that people are not doing the behavior. It's not that doing that well. And you want them to first live their understanding of what good looks like, and then assess themselves of whether they have been doing that or not. And you can also do that again by self-reports to see if they have they experienced a shift, or ask them to evaluate before the program how frequently we're doing this, and after the program how frequently you're doing this. And this is something that can be done easily. And by easily, I say that it doesn't require lots of other extra resources being involved. If there are resources available, of course, you would want that validation that managers or maybe direct reports also contributing. Are they observing that shift? If you have some other tracking systems in place where people consistently doing that, you will be using that sort of data.
Okay.
I've got a question for Mimi. It's a bit of a leading question, but one of the things I was really impressed about when I saw the Vic Roads cohort kind of present their changes was that there was, going back to Mike's point, there was quite a big shift in mindset that we saw across that leadership team. Can you talk me through, because I know it was one of your highlights this year, but that shifting mindset you saw in particular, any particular leaders that sort of changed through that process?
There was definitely a back of house leader that I remember when he did his presentation. It was the very last one at Rialto. And I even got up afterwards and I said, when you came to the very first workshop, you were leaning so far back. I think you were almost in the other room. And by about the third workshop, he came back in and his exact words was, "It's so simple, it's brilliant." And for him, it was about the journey. It wasn't about the destination. It was about building that buy-in with his people. And he even noticed as his engagement and buy-in started to shift, so did that of his people, and he realized the influence of his his coaching activities. So most definitely that back of house leader, for him, it was just an incredible transformation to be able to apply the methodology to his role. And he was a very IT-based role. So for him, he was like, I'm all process, my people are all process, this behavioural framework will definitely not work for me. But when we started to drill down into how his people actually drive the process, he started to realise he had a really big influence.
Thanks, Mimi.
Which probably leads me to my question for Mike.
Mike, yeah.
Mike, we know that generally will trumps skill. And while we like to think that everyone is coachable, at what point do we go, you know, we probably shouldn't waste their time and our time as leaders. So when do you actually know that it's probably time to, I guess, say it's more of a performance management conversation than a coaching conversation?
Okay. So I would probably start by saying that there is a fundamental belief inside of me that might cloud my answer here, right? But the fundamental belief I have is that there is always a way. There's always a way to make a breakthrough with someone that you're coaching or leading or what have you. So if anyone has a similar sort of belief like that to what I do, there can be this desire to want to keep going and keep going and keep going and to try and get that sort of change that you're looking for. But the reality in business is that there are some square pegs in round holes. Not everybody's sort of in the right role. Not everybody's happy where they are. And I think there's probably two ways I'd answer it, but the first one would be, a leader really needs to think about the opportunity cost of the time they spend working on certain problems. So if you've got 10 people in your team and one of them, you're trying to get a behavioural shift in all of them, but one of them is really, really difficult, resisting change, doesn't want to change, you could very easily dedicate the bulk of your week trying to create that shift at the expense of the other 9 team members that you've got. And I think it's much wiser for leaders to think about, you know, there's a finite amount of minutes in my week. I have to allocate them in certain ways. Can I afford to spend as much time trying to get the mindset breakthrough with this person? And is there a significant opportunity cost with it? The stock standard answer would be, you've usually got to head down performance management conversations when people have, you know, been coached a number of times. They've said they're going to change a behaviour. They don't change a behaviour. You have to escalate the type of conversation that you're having with someone at that point in time. That's the conventional one, but I think sometimes you've really got to look at sort of the opportunity cost of too much time going in one direction and what's that costing you with other people, and make the decision based on your resource of time.
All right. Well, if we don't have any more questions, guys, I might let.
Oh, can I?
Dave.
Yeah, I'd love to have a question. Just an open question. So often we hear nowadays, and I think, Pete, it relates back to your point before about this rate of change that we're experiencing, and people seem to be so busy in organisations now just doing their job that they don't actually have the time for learning. So, we put in all that LinkedIn learning, we put all the online content in front of people, but people just go, they're not doing it, right? And the numbers of people actually jumping online and completing their learning are really low, and always the excuse is, I don't have the time. So how do we combat that? How do we ensure that people do start to dedicate time for the deliberate practice required to get better?
Pete, you're on mute.
Third
time's the charm.
Yeah. It's interesting. We go into organisations all the time, and we're often really trying to get leaders to spend more time with their team, developing their team. And the first thing they'll tell you is that they haven't got a lot of time. And then when you really dig into what's driving it, you'll find that there's some reality and a lot of preference in that decision. Yeah. We've all got time to do the things that we find are really important. Yeah. I missed buying my wife a birthday present one year, and I've learnt from then on that I need to devote the time to making sure I get my wife a birthday present. So that's become really important to me. So it doesn't matter how busy I am, I find time. So I think, Dave, it actually comes back to mindset that Mike was talking. It's about your purpose. Why are you actually there? And when you explain to people the real impact that they have on their team through their behaviours and the experiences they create, they're often open to changing their mind. But Dave, that comes back to this concept of a learning culture. You've got to have the whole environment supporting the allocation of that time to that particular task. You've got to reward and recognise, and organisations are traditionally terrible at rewarding and recognising that, and they reward and recognise operational tasks again and again and again and again. So, yeah, them's my thoughts.
Yeah, nice insight. Thanks.
Just want to add on to what Pete said. It's about choice. I mean, quite often we use the circle of control to get people to understand where are you focusing your time and your energy. And quite often people have a lot of things in that circle of concern. They can't control it and they can't influence it, but they spend so much time just sitting in that space. And so when you look at what can you influence and what you can control, why aren't you focusing more on that? What you can 100% control is your own behaviour. And that's generally where coaching or deliberate practice sits. So that's a really good way to move the focus with your time and energy.
Right.
All right, guys. Thank you so much to our guests, David, Peter, Stacey, Mimi, and Mike for joining us today and sharing your thoughts. And to the audience, I hope this has somewhat, whetted your appetite for the particular topics that were discussed today. And if it has, and you want to dig a little bit deeper, the original masterclasses that each of our guests today did are available in the events section of our website. And I'll also include the direct links to those with the recording for today's session. So you can dig right in and find out more about all of the topics that we've covered. We are going to be doing more of these masterclasses next year in 2024. So if you'd like to keep up to date with all of the events that we're doing, please subscribe to the website or follow us on LinkedIn or Facebook. We'll always bombard you with only very specific and useful things to you.
Not bombard.
We'll let you know that they're coming. Yes. That's probably a better way to put it. Yes. And any further questions about anything that we've spoken about, please just email us through anything about the GRIST methodology. We'd love to hear from you. And, you know, if you've got a special topic that you'd like to share in the sort of coaching, learning improvement realm, let us know. We always like to have plenty of guests sharing their wisdom. So on behalf of everyone here at GRIST, we'd like to thank you all for coming today and wishing you a very happy holiday season. And we look forward to improving with you in 2024. Thank you so much for joining us.
Bye. Thank you.